I thought ending my 7-year marriage would be dramatic. I rehearsed the breakup speech 1,000 times in my head, practiced the perfect wounded expression in the mirror, even packed an emergency bag for when he inevitably begged me to stay. I was prepared for tears, shouting, desperate pleas, anything except what actually happened. When I finally said, I want a divorce, in our therapist's office, my husband just looked at me calmly and said, okay, no emotion, no fighting. The next day, he had already signed a lease on a new apartment. I wanted a dramatic divorce with tears and begging. Instead, he just said, okay, and moved out the next day. Like this, and share your stories in the comments if you have had something similar happen to you in the past. We would love to hear it. The night before I planned to blow up my entire life, I made Brian's favorite lasagna, not because I wanted to, but out of some twisted guilt for the bomb I was about to drop. 7 years of marriage reduced to a farewell dinner he didn't even know was a farewell. Brian barely looked up when I set his plate down. Thanks, babe, he mumbled, eyes already drifting back to his fantasy football lineup. No, how was your day? No real acknowledgement that I even existed beyond bringing him food, just the same distracted kiss on the cheek he'd given me for the past 3 years. I watched him eat, wondering when exactly this had happened to us. When had my attentive, passionate husband transformed into this stranger who seemed to barely register my presence? When had I stopped loving him and started resenting every breath he took in our shared space? It hadn't always been this way. When we first got married, I thought Brian hung the moon. He would surprise me with weekend getaways, bring me coffee in bed, and actually listen when I talked about my chaotic days at the marketing agency. We'd stay up late talking about everything and nothing. Now I couldn't remember the last meaningful conversation we'd had. I'd tried everything to reconnect. Changed my hair 3 times last year. He noticed the 3rd time, a week later. Bought new clothes that sat in my closet with tags still on. Suggested couples workshops that my friend Stephanie swore saved her marriage. Nothing worked. Brian just nodded along, said, "Sure, babe, whatever you want," and went right back to his PlayStation. The breaking point came last month on our anniversary. I'd planned everything perfectly, reserved that impossible-to-book Italian place downtown 2 months in advance, bought a new dress, even got a blowout, and Brian showed up 45 minutes late because he lost track of time, finishing some level on his stupid game. I sat there alone, nursing my drink, watching the waiter give me those pitying glances that made me want to crawl under the table and die. When Brian finally arrived, he didn't even seem to understand why I was upset. That's when I knew it was over. Not with a dramatic fight, but with the quiet realization that I'd been invisible in my own marriage for years. For weeks afterward, I secretly met with Dr. Winters, a therapist recommended by Stephanie. I originally went just to vent, but during my last session, something inside me snapped. "Have you considered couples therapy?" Dr. Winters suggested gently. I laughed, an empty, hollow sound. "What's the point?" And suddenly, I knew there was no point. This marriage was over. I didn't love Brian anymore. I didn't even like him. I nodded at Dr. Winters and said I'd bring Brian to our next session. What she didn't know was that I was planning to use that session to tell him I wanted a divorce. I spent that week planning exactly how it would go. I'd be calm but firm. I'd explain that I'd grown while he remained stagnant, how we wanted different things now, how neither of us was happy anymore, even if he wouldn't admit it. He'd be shocked at first, then probably beg me to reconsider. Brian hated change. He was so predictable that way. But I needed to stay strong. I deserved better than this half-life we were living. My friend Kayla thought I was making a huge mistake. "You don't throw away 7 years over him being a little distant," she said. Easy for her to say when her husband still looked at her like she was dessert. Stephanie was more supportive. She went through her own divorce last year and says it was the best decision she ever made. She's already dating this hot yoga instructor who actually texts her back right away. Meanwhile, I have to send Brian 3 messages before he acknowledges I exist. I haven't told my parents yet. They love Brian. My mom is always saying how lucky I am to have found such a stable man, as if stability is enough when you're dying of boredom. My dad will probably take Brian's side too. He's old school like that. Marriage is forever, work through your problems, blah blah blah. But they don't have to live my life. I do. I packed a small bag yesterday while Brian was at work. Just essentials. Kayla said I could stay with her for a few days after I dropped the bomb, just to give Brian some space to process. I'm not heartless. I know this will hurt him. Part of me still cares about him, obviously. We've been together since college, but I'm suffocating here, and I can't do it anymore. Something has to change. Tonight is our last night as a normal married couple, and he has no idea. He came home, gave me that same distracted kiss on the cheek, and asked what's for dinner. I made his favorite lasagna out of guilt, I guess. He thanked me, and then immediately went to the living room to check his fantasy football lineup. Didn't even ask how my day was. It's like I'm invisible in my own home. Tomorrow everything changes. I keep trying to feel sad about it, but mostly I just feel relief, like I can finally breathe again. Is that terrible? Maybe. But I've spent too long worrying about what Brian needs. It's time to think about what I need, and what I need is out. The night before I planned to blow up my entire life, I made Brian's favorite lasagna, not because I wanted to, but out of some twisted guilt for the bomb I was about to drop. 7 years of marriage reduced to a farewell dinner he didn't even know was a farewell. Brian barely looked up when I set his plate down. "Thanks, babe," he mumbled, eyes already drifting back to his fantasy football lineup. No, how was your day? No real acknowledgement that I even existed beyond bringing him food. Just the same distracted kiss on the cheek he'd given me for the past 3 years. I watched him eat, wondering when exactly this had happened to us. When had my attentive, passionate husband transformed into this stranger who seemed to barely register my presence? When had I stopped loving him and started resenting every breath he took in our shared space? It hadn't always been this way. When we first got married, I thought Brian hung the moon. He would surprise me with weekend getaways, bring me coffee in bed, and actually listen when I talked about my chaotic days at the marketing agency. We'd stay up late talking about everything and nothing. Now I couldn't remember the last meaningful conversation we'd had. I'd tried everything to reconnect. Changed my hair 3 times last year. He noticed the 3rd time a week later. Bought new clothes that sat in my closet with tags still on. Suggested couples workshops that my friend Stephanie swore saved her marriage. Nothing worked. Brian just nodded along, said, "Sure, babe, whatever you want," and went right back to his PlayStation. The breaking point came last month on our anniversary. I'd planned everything perfectly, reserved that impossible-to-book Italian place downtown 2 months in advance, bought a new dress, even got a blowout. And Brian showed up 45 minutes late because he lost track of time, finishing some level on his stupid game. I sat there alone, nursing my drink, watching the waiter give me those pitying glances that made me want to crawl under the table and die. When Brian finally arrived, he didn't even seem to understand why I was upset. That's when I knew it was over. Not with a dramatic fight, but with the quiet realization that I'd been invisible in my own marriage for years. For weeks afterward, I secretly met with Dr. Winters, a therapist recommended by Stephanie. I originally went just to vent, but during my last session, something inside me snapped. "Have you considered couples therapy?" Dr. Winters suggested gently. I laughed, an empty, hollow sound. "What's the point?" And suddenly I knew there was no point. This marriage was over. I didn't love Brian anymore. I didn't even like him. I nodded at Dr. Winters and said I'd bring Brian to our next session. What she didn't know was that I was planning to use that session to tell him I wanted a divorce. I spent that week planning exactly how it would go. I'd be calm but firm. I'd explain that I'd grown while he remained stagnant, how we wanted different things now, how neither of us was happy anymore, even if he wouldn't admit it. He'd be shocked at first, then probably beg me to reconsider. Brian hated change. He was so predictable that way, but I needed to stay strong. I deserved better than this half-life we were living. My friend Kayla thought I was making a huge mistake. "You don't throw away 7 years over him being a little distant," she said. Easy for her to say when her husband still looked at her like she was dessert. Stephanie was more supportive. She went through her own divorce last year and says it was the best decision she ever made. She's already dating this hot yoga instructor who actually texts her back right away. Meanwhile, I have to send Brian 3 messages before he acknowledges I exist. Tonight is our last night as a normal married couple, and he has no idea. He came home, gave me that same distracted kiss on the cheek, and asked what's for dinner. I made his favorite lasagna out of guilt, I guess. He thanked me, and then immediately went to the living room to check his fantasy football lineup. Didn't even ask how my day was. I keep trying to feel sad about it, but mostly, I just feel relief, like I can finally breathe again. Is that terrible? Maybe. But I've spent too long worrying about what Brian needs. It's time to think about what I need. And what I need is out. Tuesday finally arrived, and I felt like I might throw up. Brian asked why I scheduled a therapy appointment for both of us out of nowhere. I just said it was important, and I couldn't explain until we got there. He gave me this weird look, but didn't push it. The entire drive to Dr. Winter's office felt like torture. Brian kept trying to make small talk about some work project, completely oblivious to the bomb I was about to drop on our marriage. The waiting room was empty, except for us. Brian flipped through some outdated magazine while I checked my phone to avoid eye contact. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Dr. Winters called us in exactly at 6. Her office has these 2 identical beige armchairs facing her desk. I've sat in the left one for my individual sessions, so I took that one again. Force of habit, I guess. Dr. Winter smiled that professional therapist smile and asked, "So what brings you both here today?" She knew, of course. We had discussed my plan last week, but she had to pretend this was all new information. I looked at Brian, then back at her, and suddenly my throat felt like sandpaper. The speech I'd rehearsed 100 times vanished from my brain. "Alexis wanted to come," Brian said, breaking the silence. Said it was important. He turned to me expectantly, completely unprepared for what was coming. That's when the tears started. Not delicate, pretty crying either. Full-on ugly sobbing that I couldn't control. "I want a divorce," I finally managed to choke out. "I'm done. I can't do this anymore." The room went completely silent except for my sobs. I expected Brian to say something, anything to ask why, to tell me I was being ridiculous, to beg me to reconsider. But he just sat there, completely still, staring at me with absolutely no expression on his face. Not anger, not sadness, nothing. It was unnerving. Dr. Winters cleared her throat. "Brian, would you like to respond to what Alexis just shared?" Brian shifted his gaze from me to Dr. Winters, then back to me. His face was completely blank, like he was watching a slightly boring commercial. Then, in the most detached voice I've ever heard, he said, "Okay, let's go ahead and finalize the details." Wait, what, that's it? 7 years together and all he had to say was, "Okay?" I stopped crying for a second out of pure shock. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Where was the emotion? The fight? The drama? I'd prepared for every reaction except complete indifference. I started crying harder, a mixture of frustration and hurt taking over. "You have nothing to say?" I shouted. No emotion. No care about our marriage at all? Still nothing. He just sat there, completely unmoved by my outburst. Dr. Winters tried to guide the conversation, asking Brian about his feelings, but he barely engaged. One-word answers, no emotion. It was like talking to a brick wall. Meanwhile, I was falling apart, mascara probably all over my face, feeling increasingly stupid for expecting something more than this. The rest of the session was excruciating. Dr. Winters suggested we both take some time to process and perhaps schedule another session once emotions had settled. Brian just nodded. I couldn't even look at him anymore. This wasn't the closure I wanted. This wasn't him realizing what he was losing. This was him already checked out, probably relieved I was the one to pull the trigger. The drive home was complete silence. Not even the radio, just the sound of the wipers against a light drizzle that had started while we were inside. I kept stealing glances at Brian, trying to read his face, but there was nothing there. He stared straight ahead, both hands on the wheel, like I wasn't even in the car. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I was exhausted from crying and from the tension. We walked into the house, and without a word, Brian grabbed a blanket from the hall closet and headed straight for the couch. Not even a good night or we'll talk tomorrow. Just nothing. I stood in our bedroom doorway waiting for something. Anything. But he just arranged his pillow, turned on his side, facing away from me, and that was it. Conversation over. Marriage over. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brian's emotionless face as I poured my heart out. By morning, I was a mess of confusion and anger. I had expected him to be upset, to fight for us, maybe even to beg me to stay. His complete lack of reaction felt almost insulting. Did our marriage mean that little to him? Was he really that relieved to be rid of me? I got up early, took a long shower, and left for work before Brian woke up. I needed space to think, to process what had happened. The office was a welcome distraction. I threw myself into my projects, barely speaking to anyone. A few people noticed my red eyes, but I blamed allergies. I wasn't ready to tell the divorce story yet, especially when I didn't even understand what had happened myself. Throughout the day, I kept checking my phone, expecting some message from Brian. An angry text, a sad one, maybe even divorce lawyer recommendations. Anything. But there was nothing. Complete radio silence, as if I'd imagined our entire therapy session. By lunchtime, I was obsessively checking my phone every 5 minutes. Had he blocked me? No. My messages were going through, just not being answered. Kayla called around 2, eager for details about how the therapy session went. I stepped outside to take the call, not wanting my coworkers to overhear. He didn't even react, I told her, still in disbelief. Like, at all. He just said okay, and that was it. That's weird, Kayla said after a pause. Maybe he's in shock. Or maybe he's been feeling the same way, but didn't know how to tell you. That thought hadn't even occurred to me. Had Brian been as unhappy as I was? Is that why he accepted the divorce so easily? But then why not just tell me himself? Why let me be the bad guy? By the time I left work, I'd convinced myself that Brian had probably spent the day moving out or meeting with lawyers, maybe even changing the locks. He'd seemed so cold, so detached. Who knew what he was capable of? I drove home slowly, rehearsing what I'd say if he confronted me. But when I pulled into our driveway, his car was there, just like normal. I walked in to find Brian exactly where I'd left him that morning, on the couch, playing his PlayStation. He didn't even look up when I entered. It was as if nothing had changed, as if I hadn't just asked for a divorce less than 24 hours ago. "Have you eaten?" I asked, just to break the silence. "Ordered pizza," he replied, still not looking away from his game. "There's some left in the fridge if you want it." Small talk. We were reduced to small talk after what happened yesterday. I stood there for a minute, waiting for him to say something, anything about our situation. When he didn't, I went to the kitchen more out of habit than hunger. I opened the refrigerator, stared blankly at the pizza box, then closed it again without taking anything. I had to say something. This weird limbo was worse than any argument. I walked back to the living room, my heart pounding. "Brian," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "can we talk about what happened last night?" He paused his game, a small victory, and finally looked at me. "What is there to talk about?" he asked, his voice completely neutral. I meant everything I said, sitting down on the edge of the armchair across from him. "I told you I want a divorce. Don't you have anything to say about that?" Brian stared at me for what felt like forever. Then, with a calmness that made my skin crawl, he said, "I already got myself an apartment. Took my name off the lease here." The room started spinning. What did he just say? An apartment? Already? You what? When did you even have time to do that? "This morning," he said, still infuriatingly calm. "The property manager is a client. He had a unit available, signed the papers at lunch." I felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. In the space of one day, less than 24 hours, Brian had completely accepted our divorce and moved on. No tears, no second thoughts, no desperate attempts to save our marriage. Just done. Over. Moving out. "So that's it," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange. 7 years together and you're just leaving? Just like that? Brian shrugged. "Isn't that what you wanted? You said you were done." Everything happened so fast after that. Brian packed his essential stuff that weekend while I stayed at Kayla's, unable to watch him dismantle our life together. When I came back Sunday night, half the closet was empty, the PlayStation was gone, and so was Brian. He left his key on the kitchen counter with a note saying his lawyer would be in touch about dividing our assets. That's when it really hit me. He was gone. Really gone. And he'd made it look so easy. Like walking away from me was the simplest thing in the world. I sat on my couch, surrounded by the gaps where his things used to be, and finally let myself fall apart completely. Kayla came over with wine and ice cream, ready for a proper pity party. "I just don't understand," I kept saying through tears. "How could he just leave like that? No fight, no nothing?" "Maybe he was already checked out," Kayla suggested, pouring me another glass. "Guys are weird like that. They can be done with something emotionally way before they actually leave." But that didn't sound like Brian. The Brian I married was sensitive, emotional even. He cried at sad movies. He kept all our anniversary cards in a box under the bed. How could that same man just walk away without a single tear? The worst part was facing everyone else. My parents were shocked. They thought we were the perfect couple. "But you two never fought," my mom kept saying, as if that was proof of a good marriage, instead of what it really was. Two people who'd stopped caring enough to argue. Stephanie was more practical. "Get a good lawyer," she advised. "Even if it's amicable now, these things can get ugly fast." But it wasn't getting ugly. Brian's lawyer contacted mine, they exchanged some emails, and everything was proceeding with disturbing efficiency. No drama, no fights over who gets the blender, nothing like the divorce horror stories I'd heard from friends. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into projects, stayed late, came in early, anything to avoid going home to that half-empty apartment that still smelled faintly of Brian's cologne. My boss noticed my sudden dedication and gave me a big campaign to manage. Under normal circumstances, I would have been thrilled. Now I was just grateful for the distraction. Weeks passed. The divorce papers were moving forward. We'd agreed to sell the apartment and split the proceeds. I'd started looking at smaller places closer to downtown. Life was continuing, rearranging itself around Brian's absence. But I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that I'd somehow lost control of the situation. I was the one who asked for the divorce. I was the one who was unhappy. So why did it feel like Brian had all the power? Why was he thriving while I was still struggling to figure out how to properly budget for groceries for one person? According to mutual friends, he'd already furnished his new place, joined a gym, and seemed really good, actually. Meanwhile, I was surviving on takeout and Kayla's sympathy. One night, after one too many glasses of wine, I did something I swore I wouldn't do. I drove past his new apartment. It was in one of those modern complexes with a pool and a gym, nicer than our place. His lights were on. I could see the silhouette of him moving around inside. He wasn't hunched over in despair. He wasn't surrounded by pizza boxes and dirty laundry. He was just living his life without me. I cried the whole way home, but these tears were different. Not sad exactly, more angry. How dare he be okay when I was still a mess? How dare he move on so quickly when I was still finding his socks under the bed? It wasn't fair. None of this was turning out how I'd imagined. 3 months after that fateful therapy session, the divorce was finalized. No dramatic courtroom showdown, no tearful last-minute reconciliations, just signatures on papers and a certified letter confirming I was officially no longer Mrs. Brian Taylor. I was back to being just Alexis Wilson, 34, single, starting over. The apartment sold quickly, giving me enough money for a decent down payment on a condo closer to my office. It was smaller, but mine alone, with no empty spaces to remind me of what was missing. I painted the walls colors Brian would have hated and bought all new furniture. A fresh start. That's what everyone kept calling it. Stephanie insisted on throwing me a divorce party, complete with a cake shaped like a broken chain. It felt strange to celebrate something that still felt like a failure, but I went along with it. The photos looked great on Instagram, me smiling with my girlfriends, champagne in hand, number new beginnings. No one would guess from those pictures that I still cried in the shower sometimes. Dating again was a whole new kind of torture. Stephanie set up my Tinder profile, insisting it was time to get back out there. The men were either desperate or just looking for hookups, nothing like Brian, who had been steady and reliable. I found myself comparing everyone to him, which was ridiculous considering I was the one who wanted out of that relationship. Meanwhile, Brian seemed to be living his best life. According to our mutual friend Tom, he'd gotten a promotion and was dating someone new already. Some yoga instructor he met at his gym. The news hit me harder than I expected. I'd imagined him pining for me, realizing what he'd lost. Instead, he was moving on, becoming a better version of himself without me. "It's not fair," I complained to Kayla over brunch. "I'm the one who wanted the divorce. Why is he the one who's thriving?" Kayla gave me that look, the one that says she's about to deliver some truth I don't want to hear. "Maybe because he accepted it right away, instead of fighting it," she said gently. "You wanted out, Lex. You can't be mad that he didn't beg you to stay." But I was mad, irrationally, unfairly mad, because the truth was part of me had wanted him to fight for us, to prove that I was worth fighting for. His calm acceptance felt like confirmation of all my insecurities, that I wasn't special enough, interesting enough, lovable enough to make someone want to stay. My therapist, a new one, not Dr. Winters, who had witnessed my marriage's demise, suggested that maybe I wasn't really over Brian. "It sounds like you're still processing grief," she said gently. "That's normal after ending a long relationship." But I wasn't grieving Brian. Not exactly. I was grieving the fantasy I'd built around our divorce, the drama, the begging, the realization, too late, of what he was losing, the reality. His quick acceptance and smooth transition to single life was far less satisfying than the scenario I'd imagined. 1 year after our divorce, I ran into Brian at a mutual friend's wedding. He looked good, really good. New haircut, nice suit, confidence I hadn't seen in him for years. He was there with his new girlfriend, the yoga instructor. She was pretty in that effortless way, all glowing skin and easy laughter. We made awkward small talk at the bar. He asked about my promotion, news travels in small circles, and I asked about his new condo. He seemed genuinely happy for my success, with none of the bitterness I still carried. As we stood there exchanging pleasant nothings, I realized something that hit me like a ton of bricks. He had been ready to leave long before I was. That therapy session hadn't been the bombshell I thought it was. It had been his exit ticket from a marriage he'd already emotionally left, maybe years ago. While I'd been planning my dramatic declaration, he'd been quietly detaching, just waiting for permission to go. My big moment had been his relief. As I watched him rejoin his girlfriend, laughing at something she said, I felt a strange mix of envy and acceptance. Brian had moved on because he'd been moving on for years. I was still stuck because I never really understood what went wrong. I'd blamed him for everything, his distance, his video games, his lack of attention. I never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, I'd pushed him away long before he retreated to his PlayStation. But that realization was for another day. Tonight, I put on my best smile, danced with the groomsmen, and posted a perfectly filtered photo captioned, "Celebrating Love." No one needed to know that the person I was still figuring out how to love was myself. In the end, I got the divorce I asked for, just not the drama I secretly craved. And maybe that was the most important lesson of all. Life rarely follows the script we write for it, especially when we've been writing different stories all along. I think about that therapy session often, how I walked in certain of my role as the wounded wife, the brave one ending a failed marriage, how I expected tears, arguments, desperate pleas to try again, how I got none of that. Instead, I got a simple okay and a man who was ready with an apartment lease the very next day, a man who had clearly been waiting for an exit ramp long before I ever offered one. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd noticed earlier, if I'd seen the signs that Brian was detaching, if I'd asked different questions, made different choices. But then I remember what my new therapist keeps telling me. We can't rewrite the past, we can only learn from it. So that's what I'm trying to do now, learn from a marriage that ended not with a bang, but with a calm, decisive okay. Learn how to be honest about what I really want instead of creating dramatic scenarios in my head. Learn how to love myself enough that I don't need someone else to fight for me, to know I'm worth fighting for. When people ask me about the divorce now, I keep it simple. I tell them Brian and I wanted different things. That's true enough. What I don't tell them is that what I wanted was a dramatic ending to prove I mattered, and what Brian wanted was simply to be free.